All right, well, we're back. This is the module on sexual assault. We're going to cover a number of topics here, and let's get started. So let's take a look at the history of sexual assault. What we're going to find is that in terms of sexual assault in the legal system, basically rape was considered a property crime, if a crime at all. Under English common law, rape is an act of forced intercourse by a man of a woman other than the attacker's wife without her consent. Notice that phrase, other than the attacker's wife. When it comes to spouses, under common law, the issue of rape did not apply. The Hale Doctrine of the 17th century English common law basically stated that rape was not possible between married people of married couples, a husband and a wife, and this was also affirmed by the U.S. courts in 1857. Now, under the old common law, rape was considered a property crime violation, a protection of one man's property wife from another man. It wasn't considered an act of violent crime, an act of a property crime, because a wife was considered to be the property of her husband. So if another man raped another man's wife, that man had in effect committed a property crime against the gentleman whose wife was raped. It was almost as if, today, if someone stole something valuable from your property, that would be considered a property crime, not a violent crime. Today, we don't really think about rape as a crime of sex, but really as an act of power and control. Just like it's really a form of, in many ways, when it's seen as a form of domestic violence in a lot of situations. The Uniform Crime Report reports 101,000 rapes in 2018. This is the last year for which we have data. And this is kind of surprising because since 2014, we've seen a 20% increase in the number of reported forcible rapes in the United States. Now, we do know of the rapes that are reported, we are estimating, research shows that about half of them are what we call acquaintance rapes. In other words, the victim knew the offender in some way. Here's just a chart over time that will show you the change in forcible rapes and sodomy since 1990. Now, what's interesting about this is if you take a look here, this here, I've got it marked here in yellow, 1992, 1993, you might remember from the first couple of weeks of class, that was the time in which violent crime was at its highest peak in the United States. And since then, we've seen a steady drop in the violent crime rate. Well, the forcible rape laws kind of mirror that. You see, we've had a drop in the late 1990s. We've had a kind of level off throughout the 2000s. But in the last 5 years, really, at least almost going back to the last 6, 7, 8 years, we've seen a steady increase. Like I said, since 2014, we've seen a 20% increase in reported rapes. Now, why is that? Are more rapes occurring? Possibly. Are more rapes being reported? Possibly. Are police paying closer attention to these types of issues? All of these may be factors that are contributing to this rise in the number of rapes we're seeing in the United States, especially in the last 5 or 6 years. Okay. Now, when we talk about rape, we have to understand that there are sexual assault, that there are a number of different categories. So the first type of rape we call stranger rape. And this is what you think about in terms of walking to your car at night by yourself and some guy grabs you from behind and drags someone into the bushes and sexually assaults them. In other words, this is not a situation that occurred between two people who knew each other under any circumstances before this occurred. The second type of rape is what we call predatory rape. And predatory rape is that which uses deception. And so these are situations where people are lured into a situation in which they're raped or sexually assaulted, for example, by dating sites or, you know, perhaps being picked up by an Uber. No. Is that considered predatory or stranger? I bet it's predatory. People who are rapists who get into the Uber gig are probably doing it to pick up potential victims. So that's a form of deception. What else could be considered deception? Setting up a Craigslist meet. So I'm selling you something on Craigslist. I'll come to my house and pick it up, and something terrible happens. A sexual assault occurs. That would be an example of predatory rape. Okay. The third type is date rape, and this is where legitimate dating situations have gone terribly wrong. They may involve the rape drug or hypnol, or some people call them roofies. All three forms of rape are, well, these are the three forms of rape we talk about in our research. So about 40% of reported rapes lead to an arrest. And of the three above, the rape that is the most difficult for police to solve are stranger rape. I mean, and you can, there is no connection, and with stranger rape, you almost have to have someone who stumbles across the situation and catches the person. It's just very hard for police to catch stranger rapist, because the person who's been assaulted just has no idea who this person was, and of all the trauma they're going to suffer, the possibility of being able to identify this person, it may not be a good situation. All right. Now, we'll talk a little bit about the theories of rape, and we'll look at it from a psychological perspective, but also, and then, of course, follow that up with a sociological approach. So psychologists tend to focus on rapists they have several traits. One is that they are deficient in masculinity. And so one of the ways they regain their masculinity is through these controlling acts of sexual assault of women, largely. Secondly, psychologists see some rapists as sociopathic. In other words, they're just bad people. And they do, in addition to rape, they probably do other bad sociopathic related things. Let's see here. All right. Okay, sorry about that. Number three, psychotic. So psychology also talks about rapists as being, having some sort of mental disease, psychoses. And essentially, it's a drive for power that is achieved through sexual conquest. And that's probably an area where sociology and psychologists probably agree to some extent. Lastly, some psychology refers to the rapists as just being part of a sadistic subculture, or sadists are people who enjoy humiliating and dominating others. And so rape is a form of human behavior, a form of human deviance in which individuals are humiliated and dominated by others. All right, now let's look at the sociologists. Now, sociologists don't really believe that that individuals are quite as maladapted as psychologists think. So, why is this? Because when rapists are caught and arrested, we find out that these are people who frankly lead pretty normal lives otherwise, other than being a sadistic rapist. So the BTK killer in Kansas, Wichita, was also a rapist. And the BTK killer was a rapist who finally got caught, but he lived for years in a very normal, he had a job, worked normal, had a family, was outstanding member of his church. So this is not somebody who was just somebody who was maladapted and didn't fit into society. Here's a guy who otherwise would have been considered a pillar of conformity. Church-going member, a deacon in his church, 2 kids, great job. And he kind of just had this side gig where he was buying, torturing, and killing people, including raping them. so sociology tends to focus more is on on when we look at some norms in our culture, and one of our norms is the norm of masculinity. So let's be honest. Boys are socialized from day one to be tough, to be masculine, to not cry, to be able to protect themselves and to protect their property and to protect their families. Well, sometimes this ideology can get to a point where we create a sense of hypermasculinity, or we call a sense of being a hypermasculine, and that is where they sort of may take this concept of masculinity a step too far, and it leads to essentially ownership and domination of the other sex. Also, sociologists point out there's a lot of peer pressure to sustain sexual conquest, especially among younger men. And so this idea of, well, you've got to be the guy that has all the women may lead to a mindset where, in order to prove your worth, you're going to sexually assault women. Also, it's a way in which people maintain power over women, as we talked about with the domestic violence module. And some people blame pornography because it does turn women into commodities to be purchased and used at their leisure. And I think there's probably something to that. In our culture, we see pornography is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And all pornography objectifies somebody. I mean, most pornography is naked women, let's just be honest. And it does objectify women, and it's just a commodity. It's to be bought and sold. And what does that do? Does that value women in our society? No. When you can turn women into commodities, you devalue them, and you see women as just something to be used. And when they resist, which they should resist, rape may be the consequence of that. All right, let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about the legal system. And I'm not going to lie, the legal system has generally been on the side of the accused when it comes to rape. Here's just a reading. This was required reading for jurors before sentencing in every rape trial for a very long time. And, just to give a quote here, it must be remembered that rape is an accusation easily to be made and hard to be proved, and harder to be defended by the party accused. So essentially, the courts are telling the jurors, well, let's really double think this. Think it through very clearly. Do we really want to, don't jump to hasty conclusions about whether or not this man actually raped this woman, because it's easier to make an accusation than to prove that it didn't happen. So in essence, you're really seeing the courts as being on the side of the accused here. Prosecution and rape. So prosecutors will tell you victim testimony has never been sufficient to prove rape in court. Corroborating evidence is required. There is a research that shows that there is an asking for it culture. In other words, just a widespread belief among men and women in the United States, maybe more so among women than men in some cases, that women are partially, if not wholly, to blame for rape. And what do I mean by this? Well, things, well, look at the clothes they're wearing. Well, what was she doing out at a bar with those guys? And why did she go to those parties? Well, she shouldn't have been flirting with those guys. In essence, there's a culture here that quickly jumps to, well, she was kind of asking for it, So any rape that is not like the crazy stranger rape I described earlier, you walk into your car in the grocery store and some guy grabs you or something. Any rape that somehow is not quite completely 100% stranger and unavoidable is somehow the victim's fault, and this is wrong and very wrong. Other research shows that we don't let's think about this. In other words, Schwartz and Clear did a study that showed that people's attitude about rape victims, we tend to blame rape victims for their being victimized more so than anybody else. So, for example, their point is that we don't blame the victims of other crimes, i.e., Of course your house got robbed. It was full of nice stuff. Okay, true. We don't blame people, for that. We might, if you leave your doors unlocked, maybe we blame you, but for the most part, we don't blame people like that. In court, the victim is required to prove that they are a person of good standing and in no way deserving of rape. This is not a burden we put on any other victim of crime in our society. So someone who is the victim of rape is required to prove that they are a person of good standing and in no way deserving of this rape. People who are the victims of every other crime are never required, do not face this burden. Right? Now, here's the sad part. Even when there are witnesses, the courts don't always get everything right. Okay? Let's take the example of the case of Brock Turner. Brock Turner is the swimmer. Let's see if I can get this to pop up. And it looks like I cannot. All right, so at some point I want you to take a look at, click on this link and see this story. But Brock Turner was a swimmer from Stanford University who got drunk at a party, grabbed a girl who was maybe she was at the party, no one's really sure, and was sexually assaulting her behind a garbage dumpster on Stanford's campus when two other guys came along, saw what was happening, one of whom tackled Turner and held him while the other one called the police. They dragged him off to jail, and the judge gave him 6 months. Yeah, 6 months when the guy was literally caught in the act by two other credible witnesses and detained there by the police. So click on that story and read about the tragedy of this crime. All right. However, it's not all bad news. Things are getting better. So what we've seen is a change in the way the law approaches rape. So in the old days, there was really just sort of a focus on rape. But since 1975, we've had legal changes that are spreading out the definition of rape into a chain of different forms of criminal sexual conduct. So I showed you the chain of homicide, earlier, homicide, then there's first degree murder, second degree murder, justifiable homicide, and then we have different types of murder, like manslaughter and negligent manslaughter, non-negligent manslaughter. Same thing is now being applied to sexual criminal conduct. So in Michigan was the first state to pass these laws. And so now the sexual conduct laws are, so for example, penetration is a crime that is getting 15 to 30 years in prison versus sexual contact, which is a 2 to 15 year sentence. So we've spread out so in the past, if the contact person didn't rape the person, but just made inappropriate sexual conduct, there was no rape charge there. That person probably goes free. But today, inappropriate sexual contact means you're probably spending at least 2 years in prison and maybe up to more. Also, we started talking about first and second degree rape. So first degree rape it automatically clicks in when you have children under 14 involved, when there's a weapon or threat or a weapon used or a threat and a weapon used in the commission of the rape, or when the victim is incapacitated. Okay, and that first degree sentence will bring you extenuating circumstances, which will bring you in even more time in jail if you are caught and convicted. All right, well, that's the end of this module. Watch it a couple of times, take good notes, pay attention to the change, the materials that are on here. Thank you again for your patience as we move through this coronavirus crisis. My hat says I'm in Costa Rica, but I promise you I'm not. I'm in my study in my house on Austin Avenue. All right, you guys take care, and I'll be in touch soon. We'll be doing another module. I'll be posting another module hopefully tomorrow. Good night.